More than 35 years ago, Jesus changed his life. Even as a teenager, Bayless Conley was an alcoholic and a drug addict.
I really think that the drugs and all of those things, I recognized something was missing in my life, and I was trying to fill it, but with all the wrong things, because I never heard the message of God's love.
Bayless Conley now preaches the gospel all over the world.
We're bringing the living Jesus to a dying world. We're trying to give people hope. God changed my life, and I just want everybody on the planet to know about how wonderful Jesus is.
His show, Answers with Bayless Conley, is airing in more than 100 nations all around the globe. From alcohol and drugs to preaching the gospel. A story of redemption and transformation.
I came out of a background of drug addiction and alcoholism, and I never heard the story of the gospel till I was in my 20s. No one ever told me. And after I came to Christ, I thought, I must have gone to school with some Christians, but they never spoke up. I must have worked with some Christians, but they never told me. And I couldn't understand that. And so I just, from the moment that I gave my life to Christ, anyone that would stand still long enough, I told them about Jesus and what he's done for my life. And I just felt in my heart that that's what I was supposed to do with my life. And God has added to it, and we're still just talking to people about Jesus.
You just mentioned your past, that you had a drug and an alcohol problem in your youth. Would you tell me more about that?
Sure. As a young teenager, started using drugs and started drinking actually prior to that very heavily. And I think it was born out of several different things. One, I just was a bit wild inside. Secondly, peer pressure, like a lot of young people experience today. But I think thirdly is my heart was looking for answers. And I think people that are in drugs or they run from relationship to relationship, they're trying to fill an empty place in their heart. They're just trying to do it the wrong way, and it's being expressed in some destructive ways. And I really think that the drugs and all of those things, I recognized something was missing in my life, and I was trying to fill it, but with all the wrong things, because I never heard the message of God's love.
The important turning point happened when you met a 12-year-old in a park. How
Yes.
did that go down?
Well, the night before I had overdosed on drugs and had almost died, and was very, very depressed the next day. And I was walking through a park, and it was really strange. I found myself thinking about Jesus, but not the Jesus of the Bible. It was like Jesus, sort of a guru, a good person to pattern your life after. And I couldn't think of anything else. And as I was walking along, I stopped in the middle of a little trail, and I said out loud, just to the sky, I said, okay, I'll think about Jesus. And was thinking and thinking about him. And I walked through a children's playground area, and a little Mexican boy walked by, had a pair of cowboy boots on, hands in his pockets, and he never even looked up at me. But when he walked by, I sensed that he had something wholesome, something good, and I knew I didn't have it. And I watched him till he disappeared across the other side of the park. And I just thought, what did he have? And I walked back into the woods and went down a real steep embankment and sat next to a creek. I was completely hidden from view, and I was sitting on a rock thinking about Jesus. I had long, long hair. I had a long beard. And in about 10 minutes, that same little boy came sliding down the opposite bank and sat across the creek from me. And he looked at me and he said, do you know Jesus? And he hopped across the rocks and sat down next to me and started talking like Jesus Christ was still alive. And I'd never heard anything like that in my life. And it was from that little boy's witness that I eventually ended up in a street mission where I gave my heart to Christ.
How did you experience God talking to you for the first time? Wasn't that scary?
No, actually it wasn't. The first time that I recognized God spoke to my heart, the little boy's mother's name was Ramona. And I had all kinds of questions that I'd been asking God. I said, like, I think this is true, if Jesus is your son, the gospel, but what about this, what about that? And I actually began to even shout questions at God late one night, laying across the hood of my truck in a remote area in the mountains. And the next day, God spoke to me. And he said, go to Ramona's house. I heard it in my heart, and I just intuitively knew it was God. It wasn't frightening. I just knew. And so I went, and they're packing up to go somewhere, and I said, where are you going? They said, we're going to a street mission in the next town over. And God spoke to me a second time. And I just, in my heart, intuitively, I knew it was God. He said, I want you to go with him. And in my heart, I just argued. I said, no, I don't think so. I said, God, I'll tell you what. And I just all went on internally. I said, I'll make you a deal. If they invite me to go, I'll go. Immediately, Ramona swings around, points at me, and she says, will you go with us?
Okay.
And so I said, I'll go. And that night, as I sat in the front row on that little mission, people got up to testify, and they actually quoted the questions that I'd shouted at God that night before in the mountains and shared the answer from the Bible. Every person that got up, every question I asked, they quoted the question, shared the answer from the Scriptures, and I began to sob. And it was that night I gave my heart to Christ.
What happened after that?
As I said, I was on the street talking to anyone that would stand still long enough, telling them what God had done for me. And I won about half of my friends to Christ, and the other half of my friends wouldn't have anything to do with me anymore. And I moved down to Mexico for a while. I was involved in some missions work. I'd lived there prior to knowing Jesus and was doing some other things, but I was down there doing missions work, and eventually came back to California and started doing Bible studies in what we call rest homes. I would go visit the old people and spend hours in there every week, going from room to the old people that no one loved, that no one visited, and I'd read them Bible stories. And I learned the old hymns on my guitar, and I'd sing them hymns and prayed with them and won many of them to Christ. So I just was busy doing whatever opportunities I had.
How do you deal with rough patches in your life?
Well, first, my relationship with God. I don't just preach. It's not a profession for me. I would talk to people about Jesus even if I wasn't a pastor. So it's what I do is born out of my relationship with God. So when I go through rough patches, and everyone does, my first line of defense, if you would, is my own personal relationship with the Lord. And then I have a very strong family. I have a marvelous wife who's incredibly supportive. And then I have friends. And when I go through rough patches, I've got friends that I can call up and I hang out, and there's people we do life together. And so I'm pretty candid about sharing, my struggles with them. And so I think that through that support network of friendship and family and my relationship with God, I get through the tough places.
Is success a temptation for you?
I haven't forgotten where I've come from. And if anything, I'm just proof that God likes to use foolish things. So that's always pretty close to the front of my mind. We have a saying in English that a big shot is just a little shot away from home. And it's just good to remember where we've all come from. So I suppose there's temptation in success, but there'd probably be other areas that might be a greater temptation, for me than that. But I just, I'm very acquainted with my weaknesses and where God's brought me from.